It was only 5 minutes into my birthday dinner. My husband had just thrown my 35th birthday cake onto the floor of a five-star Manhattan restaurant. He told me to eat it off the ground while my mother-in-law smirked mockingly and my sister-in-law recorded the entire spectacle on her phone, ready to humiliate me on social media. I didn't shed a single tear. I simply wiped the vanilla frosting off my Christian Louboutin heels with a linen napkin and walked out. What they didn't know as they sat there laughing was that in my mind I was already revoking their access to every single red cent they touched. By midnight, my husband would realize that his entire life technically belonged to me. My name is Evelyn, and I am 35 years old. I work as a corporate forensic accountant and private wealth manager, which means I find hidden money for a living. If you ever needed to quietly destroy a narcissist who mistook your silence for weakness, that 35th birthday dinner was the inciting incident, and the ambient lighting of that restaurant felt like a spotlight on my worst nightmare. Marcus, my husband of 7 years, had insisted on this specific restaurant in Midtown because two prominent venture capitalists were dining in the private room right next to ours. Marcus was the founder of a logistics tech startup that was bleeding cash daily. You wouldn't know it, though, looking at his custom Tom Ford suit and his Rolex, sitting across from the shameless leeches he called family. There was Eleanor, his arrogant mother, who complained loudly about the service the moment we sat down. There was Chloe, his materialistic younger sister, who spent the entire evening taking selfies. And there was Carter, Chloe's husband. Carter was the chief financial officer of Marcus's startup. He was a slick, awful man who spoke purely in empty corporate buzzwords, a true match for my husband's arrogance. When the waiter brought out the beautifully decorated red velvet cake, I felt a fleeting moment of joy. I reached out to pull the dessert plate closer to me. Then Marcus leaned in, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with sudden inexplicable rage. "You embarrassed me out there," he whispered, his voice low but razor-sharp. I blinked at him, completely confused. I had simply introduced myself politely to the investors when he dragged me over to their table earlier. According to him, I hadn't smiled enough. I hadn't laughed loud enough at their awful jokes. I had failed to play the role of the dutiful trophy wife to a visionary tech founder. "I'm tired, Marcus," I whispered weakly, trying to keep the peace. "I just wanted a nice dinner." Marcus suddenly raised his voice, catching the attention of the surrounding tables. "You don't deserve a nice dinner. You are a miserable, ungrateful weight around my neck. I am trying to build an empire, and you can't even fake a smile to help me secure my funding." Before I could process his venomous words, his arm shot out. He violently swiped the heavy ceramic plate off the table. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the elegant dining room. The cake exploded across the polished hardwood floor, scattering chunks of red velvet and thick white frosting directly onto my designer shoes. Whispers erupted from the nearby diners. The ambient piano music suddenly felt deafening in the silence that followed at our table. "Eat it off the floor," Marcus said, adjusting his suit jacket as if he had just swatted a fly. "That's exactly where it belongs." I looked at the ruined cake, then at the faces of my in-laws. Eleanor wasn't horrified. She leaned back in her chair and smirked. "Well, she was always ungrateful, Marcus. You buy her a beautiful dinner and she ruins your mood." I glanced at Chloe. She was holding up her iPhone, the red recording light blinking. She was actually filming my public humiliation with a smile on her glossy lips. Beside her, Carter slowly shook his head with mock pity while adjusting his silk tie, looking at me like I was a pathetic employee who deserved to be fired. They expected me to cry. They expected me to make a huge scene, beg for forgiveness, or run away sobbing so they could paint me as the hysterical, unstable wife. But my rigorous training in forensic accounting taught me one vital rule for survival: emotion makes you sloppy, while data makes you lethal. I didn't cry. I calmly pulled a linen napkin from my purse, deliberately wiped the frosting off my shoes, and placed the soiled napkin on the table. I grabbed my coat, stood up straight, and looked Marcus dead in the eye with a blank expression. Then I turned around and calmly walked out of the restaurant in total silence, leaving him with the massive bill. He didn't know it yet, but that was the last meal he would ever eat using my money. I took an Uber straight back to the $15 million estate we shared in the wealthy enclave of Greenwich, Connecticut. The sprawling brick mansion was dead silent. I walked up to the master bedroom and calmly pulled a small leather overnight bag from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. I didn't throw things around the room. I didn't rip his custom suits off the hangers or smash family photos. I just folded 3 days' worth of clothes, grabbed my essentials, and packed my most important legal documents. I was just zipping the bag shut when my phone vibrated violently against the marble vanity. A text from Marcus. "We're done. Stay away for good." I stared at the glowing screen. He actually believed he was the one discarding me. He thought he was the powerful tech founder, casting aside his boring, aging wife now that he was on the verge of securing a $1,700,000,000 acquisition. He genuinely thought the money, the cars, and the house were his by right, and that I would just fade into the night, crying over my ruined life. Taking my name off everything tomorrow, I texted back. I knew he was probably sitting at that restaurant table laughing with Carter and Chloe, thinking my threat meant I'd just remove my name from a joint checking account and leave empty-handed. They fundamentally didn't understand what I did for a living. I wasn't some basic bookkeeper. I was a senior corporate forensic accountant. For the last 7 years, while Marcus played the role of the visionary genius pitching half-baked ideas to naive investors, I was the one who quietly built the complex financial infrastructure that kept his fragile world from collapsing. I didn't just manage his books. I owned the infrastructure. I held the master keys to the kingdom he thought he ruled. I walked into my home office and sat behind my heavy mahogany desk. I opened my highly encrypted work laptop and bypassed my multi-factor authentication protocols. The screen's glow illuminated the dark room. First, I logged into the master portal of our primary financial institution. I navigated to the joint high-limit Amex Centurion Black cards. These were the exact cards Marcus used to buy expensive drinks for his buddies. These were the cards Eleanor used to fund her weekly spa days and designer shopping sprees on Fifth Avenue. I hovered my cursor over the Account Management tab. With one click, I selected Revoke Access for all authorized users except Primary. The digital guillotine dropped. Next, I moved to the vehicle leasing accounts. Marcus drove a custom-leased Porsche 911 that cost over $2,500 a month. He loved parading that sports car around the city as concrete proof of his success. I found the autopay mandate linked to my private trust account. I canceled it permanently. The next time the luxury dealership tried to pull their monthly payment, it would bounce immediately, flagging the car for repossession. Then I turned my attention to the corporate accounts. I was the silent guarantor for his startup's initial funding, meaning I had administrative oversight over the corporate banking structure. Carter, the arrogant CFO, thought he was a genius at hiding discretionary funds. He and Marcus regularly used the startup's expense accounts to fund their lavish lifestyles under the guise of client entertainment. I accessed the corporate backend and initiated a hard freeze on all discretionary spending and corporate credit lines, citing suspicious activity and guarantor review. Carter wouldn't be able to buy a paperclip with company money by morning. I didn't stop there. I hit the recurring billing systems. The exclusive Greenwich Country Club membership, where Eleanor spent her afternoons drinking martinis, terminated. The monthly auto transfer allowance to Chloe, which Marcus had forced me to set up because she struggled to pay her rent, permanently deleted. I systematically dismantled the financial life support system of 4 arrogant people in under 20 minutes. When I finally finished, I closed the laptop. The silence in the house felt different now. It wasn't the silence of an empty home. It was the absolute stillness of a trap waiting to spring. I grabbed my overnight bag, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me. I drove to a luxury hotel in Manhattan, checked into a gorgeous suite, and ordered a glass of expensive red wine from room service. I slept deeply knowing that in just a few hours the sun would rise, and Marcus's entire fabricated reality would violently collapse around him. At exactly 7:00 a.m., the first digital trap snapped. I was sitting in a plush hotel bathrobe sipping a perfectly brewed espresso when my laptop screen lit up. As the financial administrator, I received real-time push notifications for every transaction denial. The first alert popped up in bright red text. Transaction. Declined at artisanal coffee shop. Soho. Amount $15. I smiled. I knew exactly where Marcus was. And more importantly, I knew who he was with. Her name was Lexi. She was a 4-year-old marketing assistant at his startup. She loved posting aesthetic office pictures on her Instagram, always ensuring Marcus's expensive watch or monogrammed briefcase was visible in the background. For the last 6 months, Marcus thought he was an absolute genius at hiding his little affair. He used company funds disguised as client entertainment to buy her expensive dinners and weekend hotel stays. I had known about Lexi since week 2. I just let him keep digging his own grave while I meticulously collected the evidence. I could picture the scene perfectly. Marcus standing at the sleek marble counter trying to buy a vanilla bean latte and an imported almond croissant for his young mistress. He'd hand the barista his black card with a smug smile. Then the machine would make a harsh, unforgiving beep. Declined. I imagined the slight shift in his posture, the arrogant chuckle as he apologized to Lexi, and the barista blaming a random bank security feature. Desperate, he'd pull out his corporate expense card. Declined. The line of wealthy New York commuters behind them would start getting impatient. Finally, Marcus, the self-proclaimed financial genius, would be forced to stand there in total humiliation as his 4-year-old assistant opened her own purse to pay for their breakfast. The digital alerts kept rolling in as he frantically tried to use ATMs across the street. By 8:00 a.m., my phone was vibrating so hard it nearly fell off the nightstand. I picked it up and casually looked at the wall of notifications. 49 missed calls. A new voicemail popped up. I put the phone on the glass coffee table and hit play on speaker. "Evelyn, answer the damn phone right now," he screamed, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and pure panic. The sound of city traffic blared in the background. "I'm at a coffee shop and none of my cards are working. Carter is calling me panicking because the corporate accounts are completely frozen. Stop being a petty, jealous child and fix this glitch immediately. I have a major acquisition meeting with the Apex Corporation executives this week, and I don't have time for your pathetic temper tantrums. Turn the cards back on or I swear you will regret this." I didn't feel a shred of fear. I just tapped the screen and exported the audio file. I forwarded it directly to a secure legal transcription service I used for high-stakes corporate fraud investigations. Within minutes, a certified transcript hit my encrypted email. I dragged the audio and transcript into a new secure folder on my desktop and renamed it Divorce Exhibit A. The chessboard was set. My first pawn had just moved. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Carter. I answered, adjusting the fabric of my luxury robe, and said nothing. Carter didn't bother with a greeting. He launched into an aggressive, highly rehearsed monologue filled with heavy corporate buzzwords, hoping to intimidate me into submission. He loudly accused me of tortious interference with their vital business operations. He claimed I was breaching my fiduciary duties and acting with malicious intent to sabotage a $1,700,000,000 corporate acquisition. He smugly informed me that his elite legal team was already drafting a massive lawsuit that would bankrupt me, and threatened to contact the State Board of Accountancy to have my CPA license permanently revoked if I didn't restore access within 60 seconds. I let him talk until he literally ran out of breath. It was genuinely amusing. Carter only got the CFO job because he was married to Marcus's sister. He spent his days making colorful spreadsheets while I was the one actively structuring the debt that kept their operations afloat. "You fundamentally misunderstand the gravity of this situation, Carter." I finally said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion. I didn't manually freeze those cards. The bank's automated risk management software triggered an enterprise-wide freeze. Carter laughed loudly. He arrogantly demanded to know why a major financial institution would suddenly trigger a severe risk management freeze without warning, accusing me of lying to cover my tracks. That was the exact moment I dropped the anvil. "Did you completely forget the terms of the angel investor loan we secured 3 years ago?" I asked. As the primary guarantor of that specific financial instrument, I retain the absolute legal right to trigger a call provision at my own personal discretion. I formally contacted the lending institution at 6:00 a.m. I triggered the call provision. The line went dead silent. A call provision allows a lender to demand full and immediate repayment of the outstanding loan balance without negotiation. I had legally called a $5 million business loan on a startup that had absolutely zero liquid cash in its primary checking account. The bank immediately classified the business as a severe default risk, freezing every credit line, asset, and card tied to Marcus's name to prevent capital flight. I heard Carter's heavy breathing. The arrogant corporate jargon completely vanished from his vocabulary. He stammered his brain, short-circuiting as the weight of the situation crushed him. He was the CFO, and he had completely overlooked the most dangerous clause in their foundational debt structure. Without that $5 million, their operational runway was zero. The impending Apex Corporation acquisition would derail instantly if the target company was actively defaulting on commercial debt. "You have 24 hours to secure alternative funding and pay off the outstanding balance, Carter," I said coldly. "Have a highly productive morning." Before I hit end, I heard a frantic rustling. Carter had pulled the phone away from his face but forgot to hit mute. I heard Marcus in the background asking what was wrong. "She called the angel loan," Marcus Carter whispered in a desperate, panicked voice. "The bank froze everything. We're dead in the water unless we show her who's really in charge." We need to go back to the estate right now and throw her out on the street. We force her to reverse this or the Apex deal is dead. I quietly ended the call. They were heading to the house expecting to find a terrified broken wife. They had no idea what was waiting for them. I checked out of the hotel and drove my car back to our $15 million estate in Greenwich. I had about 45 minutes to prepare the battlefield. I unlocked the heavy oak front door, disabled the security system, and went straight to the custom gourmet kitchen. I brewed a fresh double shot of espresso, carried my porcelain cup and my locked leather briefcase into the grand living room, and sat perfectly centered on the pristine white leather sofa. I faced the entryway and waited for the storm. Right on schedule, tires screeched on the circular driveway. The front door was violently shoved open, slamming against the interior wall. Marcus stormed in his face, flushed red with rage. Behind him was Carter, his designer suit wrinkled from panic. Eleanor and Chloe marched in next, carrying the unearned confidence of an invading army. Eleanor didn't even pause to assess the situation. She marched straight to the entryway closet, yanked the door open, and started violently pulling my designer winter coats off the hangers. She walked back to the open front door and began throwing my expensive clothes directly onto the manicured front lawn. "Get out of my son's house, you ungrateful, pathetic gold digger," Eleanor shrieked, her shrill voice echoing off the high ceilings. "He worked himself to the bone to give you this luxurious life, and you try to ruin his business out of pure jealousy. Pack your bags and get out of this neighborhood." Chloe stood near the foyer, filming the chaos on her iPhone, just like she had at the restaurant. "Hope you enjoy living in some cheap, roach-infested apartment," she mocked, a malicious smile on her face. "You won't see a single cent of Marcus's acquisition money. You're officially cut off." Marcus aggressively closed the distance, looming over me to use his physical size for intimidation. "Hand over the house keys and your security fobs right now, Evelyn," he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "You are going to get on that computer and reverse the bank freeze. If you don't comply, I am calling the local police and having you escorted off my property for criminal trespassing." Beside him, Carter crossed his arms, looking at me with total disgust. "You overplayed your hand," Carter said smugly. "You thought you could hold our tech company financially hostage, but you completely forgot who actually owns this real estate. You have zero leverage here. The show is over." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or try to stop Eleanor from throwing my favorite cashmere coat into the dirt. I just sat there, slowly, crossed my legs, and took a sip of my hot espresso. I let them exhaust their pathetic attempts at intimidation for a full 5 minutes. They screamed, hurled insults, and paraded around my beautiful living room like rabid dogs demanding my surrender. When they finally ran out of breath, the screaming faded into heavy panting and furious glares. "Are you all quite finished?" I asked softly, placing my empty cup on the glass coffee table. Marcus opened his mouth to scream another threat, but I raised a hand, silencing him. I calmly reached over and unlatched my heavy leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of official legal papers bound by a heavy black clip. The first page bore a very clear state seal and a county clerk's certification stamp. I placed the document on the glass table directly in front of Marcus. Marcus sneered, refusing to even pick it up, probably assuming it was a meaningless accounting ledger. But Carter's trained eyes couldn't help but read the bold black text. All the blood drained from Carter's face. He reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the document. "What is it?" Carter Marcus snapped, annoyed by his brother-in-law's sudden silence. Carter swallowed hard, looking at me with pure terror. "He doesn't own the house," Marcus Carter whispered. "The deed isn't in his name." Marcus laughed loudly. "That's bullshit. I bought this $15 million estate 5 years ago. The original mortgage is in my name." I leaned forward, resting my arms on my knees. I looked Marcus dead in the eye and stripped away the final layer of his delusion. I politely reminded him of the severe financial crisis he faced exactly 3 years ago when his first venture failed, leaving him drowning in debt and facing imminent bankruptcy. The bank was preparing to foreclose on this exact mansion. "You were desperate, Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You came to me begging for a sophisticated financial solution. I advised you to transfer the property deed to an anonymous LLC to legally shield the asset from your aggressive creditors. You happily signed the transfer papers without even reading the fine print. You genuinely believed that LLC was just a protective shell account managed by your high-paid lawyers." Marcus's smug smile finally cracked. "I am the sole owner and managing director of that anonymous LLC," I stated clearly. "I personally paid off your massive impending debts using funds from my own private trust. You don't own a single brick of this estate, Marcus. I am your landlord, and you've been living rent-free in my house for the last 3 years. I tapped the front page of the packet. Because there is no formal lease agreement and you are exhibiting hostile behavior toward the property owner, a judge granted an expedited order of eviction. You have exactly until tomorrow morning to vacate my property, or the sheriff's department will physically remove you. Eleanor let out a sharp gasp, her knees giving out. She collapsed dramatically into a velvet armchair, clutching her chest. The reality of being evicted from the luxurious home she loved bragging about at the country club was breaking her fragile mind. Chloe dropped her iPhone onto the rug. Marcus lost his mind. His face twisted into pure fury. "You treacherous, lying snake," he roared. He violently kicked the glass coffee table and lunged directly at me, fists clenched. I didn't move a muscle to defend myself. I just casually pointed a finger toward the upper corner of the high ceiling. Marcus froze inches away from me, following my gaze. Neatly mounted in the corner was a brand new high-security camera. A small red light blinked continuously. I had those live streaming cameras installed throughout the house yesterday afternoon, while you were busy buying cheap jewelry for your 4-year-old mistress, I said evenly. The footage uploads directly to a secure cloud server. If you so much as touch me, I will hand the footage to the police and file felony assault charges. Good luck closing a $1.7 billion corporate acquisition from a dirty holding cell. Marcus stood there trembling with rage and absolute defeat. He looked at the camera, then at the eviction notice, and finally at me. He was completely trapped. "Get the trash bags," he finally said to a stunned Carter and his terrified mother. "We need to start packing." I sat comfortably on my white leather sofa and peacefully watched my ungrateful in-laws spend 4 hours packing their most valuable possessions into the trunks of their cars. I watched as Marcus angrily dragged his expensive golf clubs out the front door. Eleanor cried dramatically in the driveway, clutching her designer scarves like a refugee fleeing a war. Carter paced the lawn, making frantic calls to his corporate lawyers. By late afternoon, the estate was finally silent. I immediately had the locks changed by a professional locksmith I had quietly scheduled the day prior. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of cold water when my phone vibrated. The caller ID showed Chloe's name. I knew exactly what tactic they were deploying next. Since Marcus and Carter were stripped of their power, and Eleanor was paralyzed by her loss of status, it was Chloe's turn to play the designated peacemaker. I swiped to answer and held it to my ear without a word. A loud, theatrical sob echoed through the speaker. "Evelyn, please tell me you aren't really doing this," Chloe cried, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Mom is completely devastated. She's sitting in the lobby of a cheap roadside motel right now, crying because she can't believe you'd throw her out on the street. How could you do this to family? We treated you like a sister. You're destroying us over a stupid argument at a restaurant." I took a slow sip of water. "You do not get to use the word family with me, Chloe," I said, my voice devoid of warmth. "Family is supposed to protect you. Family doesn't sit at a dinner table and record their sister-in-law being publicly humiliated to mock her on social media later." She sniffled loudly, trying to pivot. "I'm sorry about the restaurant. Marcus was just stressed about the Apex deal and we were all drinking. But you're punishing Mom for something Marcus did. You have to let her come back to the house." "I am not punishing Eleanor," I stated firmly. "I am simply removing my financial support from parasites. And don't think for a second I forgot what you did, Chloe." The fake crying instantly stopped. "What are you talking about?" she asked, real panic tightening her voice. I reminded her of exactly what happened 3 years ago, right before the holidays. I had a beautiful vintage sapphire ring that belonged to my late grandmother, the only physical thing I had left to remember her by. One weekend, it mysteriously vanished from my jewelry box. Eleanor immediately blamed the housekeeping staff and fired them to close the case. But I was a forensic accountant. I knew how to trace stolen assets. I told Chloe how I pulled the security logs for our gated community and matched her car leaving the estate at the exact time the ring went missing. I explained how I traced pawnshop records in the city and found her signature on the receipt. She had pawned my grandmother's priceless heirloom for $5,000 just to buy a limited edition designer handbag she wanted to show off. Eleanor knew exactly what she had done and actively covered it up to protect her precious daughter. "You thought I never found out," I said coldly. "I went to that pawn shop and bought my grandmother's ring back with my own money." I stayed quiet because I realized that day exactly who I was dealing with. "You are not my family. You are parasites. and the host has finally decided to cut you all off. The fake sweet sister tone vanished. A cruel, bitter laugh came through the speaker. You think you're so smart, don't you, Evelyn? You think because you took the house you won this little war. You're just a boring, miserable accountant. Carter is 10 times smarter than you. I didn't interrupt. I wanted her to keep talking and reveal their desperate next move. Carter already has a plan to completely ruin you financially, she threatened. You think you can just freeze the company accounts and ruin Marcus's Apex deal? Carter knows how to move assets out of your reach. By the time my husband is done with you, you won't see a single cent of that $1,700,000,000 acquisition. You'll be left with nothing while Marcus becomes a massive tech billionaire. You messed with the wrong family. Thanks for the update, Chloe, I replied calmly and pressed end. I already knew Carter's plan because it was the most predictable move a failing corporate officer could make. They were going to try to hide the company assets. They were about to step into the ultimate financial trap I had been meticulously preparing for years. When you spend your entire career tracing hidden assets and unraveling complex corporate fraud, the desperate moves of cornered men become incredibly predictable. Sitting at my kitchen island with my laptop open, I watched their digital footprints light up my screen like a glowing map. They had retreated to a dingy rented conference room on the edge of the city. I could easily picture Marcus pacing the cheap carpet in blind panic, while Carter sat at a laminate table desperately trying to salvage their ruined empire. The true value of Marcus's logistics startup was never in the expensive office furniture, the leased company cars, or the frozen checking accounts. The entire $1,700,000,000 valuation rested on a single critical asset, the proprietary routing software code, the core intellectual property. Carter, being the arrogant CFO, understood that if they could successfully detach that digital asset from the collapsing parent company, they could still push the acquisition through with Apex Corporation. I watched the live network security logs as Carter logged into a secure virtual private network VPN. He was actively executing the exact illegal strategy Chloe had threatened me with. Carter was hastily setting up a new shell company in the Cayman Islands, utilizing strict corporate secrecy laws to hide their true identities behind anonymous registered agents. His goal was to create an empty corporate vessel and quietly execute a fraudulent contract, transferring the exclusive rights of the software code directly to it. By moving the IP out of the original startup, he planned to leave me fighting in divorce court over the frozen bank accounts of a completely worthless, empty shell. Once the software was safely hidden inside the new entity, Marcus and Carter would present that new company to the Apex executives, sign the final papers, and sell the newly formed entity for the full $1,700,000,000. The payout would bypass the frozen accounts I controlled. Marcus would become a multimillionaire overnight. Carter would get his massive executive bonus. And they both believed I'd be left holding nothing but a worthless piece of paper linking me to a dead bankrupt startup. Over the next few hours, I quietly followed the digital breadcrumbs of their felony in real time. I saw the expedited wire transfers from Carter's personal offshore accounts to the Cayman registered agent. I watched the automated email confirmations hit the main corporate server as they drafted fraudulent IP transfer agreements. Marcus actively signed away the lifeblood of his company using entirely forged board approval documents. They were committing blatant corporate fraud and federal wire fraud right in front of my eyes. Carter thought the corporate veil would create an impenetrable legal fortress. What he fundamentally failed to realize was a basic rule of corporate law. You cannot legally transfer an asset that you do not actually own in the first place. I poured another glass of cold water and calmly closed my laptop for the night. I didn't try to block the digital document transfers. I didn't call my lawyers to file an emergency injunction. I just let them do it. I wanted them to walk into the Apex Corporation boardroom later that week, feeling invincible. The higher they climbed their fragile ladder of lies, the more devastating their inevitable fall would be. The next morning, I went into my office in Midtown Manhattan. I needed the secure commercial printers to finalize the hard copies of the financial evidence I had meticulously collected. Around noon, I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of my corporate building, planning to grab a quick, healthy lunch at a bistro across the street. Evelyn. Wait, a high-pitched voice called out. I stopped and turned. Approaching me with entirely unearned confidence was Lexi. She was wearing a tailored designer dress I instantly recognized from a recent charge on the corporate expense account. A pair of oversized, expensive sunglasses rested on her head, and she held an iced matcha latte. She looked me up and down with a mocking smile that rivaled Marcus's. "You need to stop torturing Marcus," Lexi said, stepping into my personal space. "You're acting crazy. Just because of a simple breakup, he's about to close a $1,700,000,000 acquisition with Apex this week, and you're just trying to sabotage him out of pure jealousy. I looked at the two 4-year-old girls standing in front of me. She had no idea what kind of legal hurricane she was standing in. I simply asked her what she wanted from me. "I want you to walk away," Lexi said, arrogantly crossing her arms. "Marcus is going to be a multimillionaire. He needs a partner who actually understands his vision and fits his new lifestyle. You're just a boring accountant. Sign whatever divorce papers his lawyers send and leave quietly before you embarrass yourself further." To emphasize her point, she casually tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, making sure the bright afternoon sun caught the glittering diamonds of the expensive tennis bracelet on her right wrist. I stared at the diamond bracelet for a moment. Then I calmly unzipped my leather portfolio. I pulled out a crisply printed spreadsheet and handed it to her. Lexi looked at the paper skeptically before snatching it. "What is this?" she asked, her eyes skimming the dense rows of numbers. "That is a detailed forensic accounting of Marcus's actual net worth," I explained, my voice perfectly level. "I want you to look closely at the bottom line on the second page. Lexi Marcus is not a multimillionaire. He has exactly $7 million in personal and corporate debt. Every credit card he owns is maxed out and currently frozen by the bank due to severe default risk." Lexi laughed nervously, but her eyes darted across the spreadsheet. "You just made these numbers up. He bought me a $60,000 diamond bracelet last week." I nodded slowly. "I know about the bracelet, Lexi. In fact, if you look at the highlighted section in the middle of that page, you will see the exact transaction record for that specific jewelry store. I want you to read the name of the account those funds were drawn from." Lexi looked down at the paper. "It says, Employee 401k Matching Fund." She read, her voice suddenly losing all its arrogant confidence. "What does that mean?" "It means Marcus and Carter are actively embezzling money from their employees' retirement accounts," I said coldly. "They are illegally siphoning funds meant for their workers' futures and hiding it as client entertainment expenses. That is exactly what paid for your luxury hotel weekends, your designer dress, and that beautiful diamond bracelet currently on your wrist." The iced matcha latte in her hand began to shake violently as the terrifying reality of my words crashed down on her. "Embezzling employee retirement funds is a severe federal crime, Lexi," I continued, stepping slightly closer to her. "And because you are an official employee of the marketing department, who regularly signs off on those fake expense reports, you are actively handling stolen property. When federal investigators audit the company later this week, they will see that you directly benefited from a massive corporate fraud scheme. You aren't going to be a tech billionaire's wife, Lexi. You are going to be indicted as a criminal accessory to federal wire fraud." The mocking smile completely vanished. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale and suddenly looking very young. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist as if it had suddenly caught fire. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a quiet, terrified gasp. She dropped her iced drink directly onto the concrete, shoved the spreadsheet back into my hands, and turned around. She practically sprinted down the Manhattan sidewalk in her designer heels, desperate to get as far away from Marcus's sinking ship as possible. I carefully placed the spreadsheet back into my portfolio and peacefully crossed the street to buy my lunch. While I was enjoying my organic salad, Marcus was having a complete meltdown on the other side of the city. The sudden departure of his young mistress was the least of his problems. I knew his exact schedule because I still had full access to his digital calendar. At 1:00 p.m., he had an emergency meeting scheduled at a major commercial bank in the financial district. Because Carter had failed to secure alternative funding after I triggered the Angel loan call provision. Marcus was desperately trying to secure a short-term commercial bridge loan to keep his company afloat until the Apex acquisition officially closed. Marcus walked into the bank's grand marble lobby, wearing his most expensive custom suit, carrying his designer briefcase, projecting the unearned swagger of a massive tech visionary. He was escorted to a plush glass-walled office overlooking Wall Street. The senior bank manager, Mr. Sterling, shook his hand and offered him a seat. Marcus launched into his highly rehearsed sales pitch, bragging about his logistics startup using empty corporate buzzwords. He casually dropped that Apex Corporation was acquiring his company for $11.7 billion at the end of the week, acting as if asking for a temporary $500,000 bridge loan was just a minor administrative formality. Mr. Sterling listened, politely nodding. He turned to his computer monitor and began typing to pull up Marcus's commercial financial profile. Marcus confidently checked his expensive watch, expecting approval in under 5 minutes. But the senior bank manager suddenly stopped typing. A deep, confused frown appeared on his face. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and told Marcus there must be a major clerical error. Marcus laughed arrogantly, agreeing that banking software often glitched when dealing with high-net-worth individuals like himself. He demanded Mr. Sterling manually override the system and approve the loan. Mr. Sterling slowly shook his head. He politely informed Marcus that he could not manually override a business credit history that had catastrophically flatlined. Marcus was stunned. A flatlined credit history is a total catastrophe in the commercial sector, the record of a completely bankrupt, derelict entity. Marcus aggressively raised his voice, accusing the bank of gross negligence and threatening to pull all his future wealth from their institution. Mr. Sterling remained perfectly calm. He turned his monitor around so Marcus could see the bright red alerts flashing on the screen. The manager explained why the score had crashed overnight. The primary holding company that guaranteed the massive operational lease for Marcus's Midtown headquarters had officially filed a formal notice of severe default. The commercial landlord immediately reported the default to the major credit bureaus, entirely destroying Marcus's business credit profile in a matter of hours. Marcus stared at the screen in total horror. He knew exactly who controlled that holding company. I did. When I dismantled his financial infrastructure, I didn't just freeze his credit cards. I actively severed the corporate guarantee, keeping his expensive office open. Mr. Sterling firmly stated that the bank could not issue a single cent of credit to an entity actively defaulting on its primary operational lease, and politely but coldly asked Marcus to leave the office immediately. Marcus walked out of the commercial bank, empty-handed, his arrogant facade completely shattered. While Marcus was being shown the door in Manhattan, his mother, Eleanor, was marching into her local retail bank branch in Greenwich. When Marcus called her that morning in a pure panic, complaining that I had unfairly frozen his corporate accounts, Eleanor decided she would play the savior. She had a massive retirement savings account. She planned to withdraw a cashier's check to personally fund Marcus's bridge loan, proving a mother's love was superior to a wife's loyalty. She approached the teller counter, wearing her signature silk scarf. Smelling heavily of expensive perfume, she confidently slammed her platinum debit card onto the marble counter and loudly announced she needed to withdraw her entire retirement savings balance into a certified bank draft, making sure everyone in line heard her. The young bank teller smiled politely and swiped the card. She typed a few commands and waited for the screen to load. Then the teller's friendly smile slowly faded. She blinked a few times and retyped the account number. Finally, she looked up at Eleanor with an expression of genuine pity. "I apologize, ma'am," the teller said gently, "but your current account balance is exactly $800. Eleanor laughed loudly and slammed her hand on the counter. "That is impossible," she shrieked. "I have over $8 million in that high-yield retirement account. Call your branch manager immediately. Your machine is clearly broken." Within 2 minutes, the branch manager escorted the furious Eleanor into a private office. Eleanor sat in a leather chair, loudly threatening to sue the bank for gross negligence. The manager didn't argue. She simply turned her computer monitor around and printed the last 6 months of account statements. Eleanor snatched the papers. They showed a continuous series of massive outgoing wire transfers. $1 million here, $1 million, $500,000 there. Every transaction was sent directly to the primary operating account of Marcus's logistics startup. The withdrawals had systematically drained her entire life savings. "This is massive bank fraud," Eleanor gasped, her hands shaking. "Someone hacked my account and stole my money. I never authorized any of these transfers." The branch manager opened a separate digital file and slowly turned the screen toward Eleanor. "The bank made no error, ma'am," the manager explained softly. "These transfers are completely legal and were authorized by your registered financial proxy 6 months ago. You submitted a notarized document granting full durable power of attorney over this specific account to your son Marcus." Eleanor stared at the digital copy of the legal document. Down at the very bottom of the page was her own undeniable signature. Her mind flashed back to a lavish family dinner exactly 6 months ago. Marcus had brought a thick stack of complex legal papers to the restaurant. He handed her a glass of expensive champagne, flashed his charming golden boy smile, and told her he was setting up a massive internal investment portfolio for the tech startup that would guarantee her a huge return. Eleanor was so proud of her successful son that she didn't read a single word of the fine print. She eagerly signed wherever he pointed. He hadn't set up an investment portfolio. He desperately needed cash to artificially inflate his failing startup metrics before pitching the massive acquisition to Apex Corporation. When the angel loan funds started running out, Marcus didn't cut back his lavish lifestyle or stop buying expensive gifts for his mistress. He quietly used his own mother's blind trust and completely drained her retirement fund to cover his tracks. I already knew what she was going to discover at the bank today. During my forensic audit of the startup last month, I traced the origin of those sudden cash injections. But I also knew it wasn't my legal responsibility to protect a woman who spent 5 years treating me like garbage. I let her discover the brutal truth herself. The heavy realization hit Eleanor like a physical punch to the chest. The golden child she had protected and enabled her entire life had completely robbed her. She had no massive nest egg. She had no mansion to return to. She was a 60-year-old woman sitting in a bank office with exactly $800 to her name. Eleanor buried her face in her shaking hands and began to cry. And this time the tears were completely real. That evening, I received a highly formal email directly from Carter. The subject line was simply, settlement discussion. He requested a private dinner at a very quiet, dimly lit steakhouse on the outskirts of Manhattan. Because Marcus was in a complete meltdown and Eleanor was neutralized by financial ruin, Carter realized he was the only one left who could possibly salvage the $1,700,000,000 acquisition. He viewed himself as the ultimate rational dealmaker. He thought he could just swoop in, flex his corporate muscles, and successfully bully me in a quiet corner. I immediately accepted the calendar invitation. I spent an hour carefully selecting a simple, conservative outfit and making sure my high-def digital voice recorder was fully charged and safely concealed inside the lining of my leather handbag. When I arrived at the restaurant, Carter was already seated in a secluded corner booth. He was wearing a new designer suit and had ordered a $200 glass of imported scotch. He was trying to project an aura of absolute power and unbothered confidence, even though I knew he was paying for that drink with his personal credit card because the corporate accounts were still frozen. I sat across from him and politely declined the waiter's offer for a cocktail, asking only for a glass of sparkling water. Carter didn't waste time on small talk. He leaned across the white tablecloth and slid a thick manila folder directly toward me. He looked at me with a deep mocking smile, acting like a generous king granting a pardon to a lowly peasant. Inside that folder is a comprehensive and final settlement offer, Evelyn Carter said smoothly, using his best executive voice. Marcus is prepared to be incredibly generous, despite the absolute chaos you've caused this week. We are offering you a lump sum payment of exactly $5 million to walk away forever. All you have to do is sign the attached non-disclosure agreement, formally waive any and all claims against the startup, and immediately reverse the commercial bank freeze. Take the cash, buy a nice little condo, and let the real adults get back to doing high-level business. I opened the folder and slowly read the dense legal document. It was a complete waiver of all my marital rights. I closed the folder and looked back at him. $5 million is nothing compared to half of a $1,700,000,000 corporate acquisition. Carter, I replied deliberately, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. Carter laughed loudly and took a slow sip of his scotch. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing into a cold, calculated glare. If you refuse to sign that paper, Evelyn, you won't see a single cent of that acquisition money. In fact, you'll be left completely bankrupt. We hired the most vicious corporate litigators in the country. If you try to drag Marcus into divorce court, we will tie you up in aggressive civil litigation for the next 2 decades. We will bury your lawyers in so much useless paperwork that your legal fees will entirely drain whatever pitiful savings you have left. It was time to spring the trap. I played my part perfectly. I let my shoulders slump slightly. I looked down at my sparkling water, pretending to be utterly defeated and terrified by his legal threats. I let my voice tremble slightly as I spoke. I don't understand how you can be so absolutely sure I'd lose in court, I whispered, sounding desperate and innocent. The intellectual property is legally a shared marital asset. No judge in the country is going to let Marcus sell the core software code to Apex Corporation without giving me my fair share of the profits. You can't just hide $1,700,000,000. Carter took the bait completely. His massive ego couldn't resist the overwhelming urge to brag about his own perceived genius. He smiled a wide, arrogant smile, genuinely believing he had completely broken my spirit. That's where you are entirely wrong, Evelyn, he bragged, his voice dripping with contempt. Did you think we were selling Marcus's original startup to Apex? No. I personally set up a completely anonymous Cayman Shell company yesterday afternoon. Legal contracts are currently being executed to fully transfer the exclusive rights of the proprietary software code out of the old company and directly into the new entity. He leaned back in the leather booth, looking incredibly pleased with himself. By the time you even step foot in a family court, the original company you are fighting over will be a completely worthless empty shell. You can't claim half of an asset that no longer exists within the marital estate. Apex is buying the clean company and the massive payout goes entirely to us. I engineered the entire corporate bypass to ensure you get nothing. So I highly suggest you take the $5 million now, while I'm still feeling generous. I sat there in the dimly lit booth, letting his words hang in the air. He had just laid out his entire illegal blueprint with the pride of a professor explaining a brilliant thesis. He clearly admitted on the record that the sole purpose of the corporate entity was to actively defraud me of my legal marital assets and bypass the frozen commercial accounts. It was a textbook confession to federal wire fraud and severe corporate malfeasance. I slowly reached across the table and pulled the manila folder toward my chest. I need at least 24 hours to review these complex terms with an attorney, I said, keeping my head slightly bowed in fake defeat. Carter chuckled darkly and signaled the waiter for the bill. Take all the time you need, Evelyn, he said, standing up and adjusting his expensive suit jacket. Just remember, the clock is ticking, and my offer expires. The second Apex signs the final contract. He walked out of the restaurant, projecting total victory. I waited until he was completely out of sight before I reached into my leather handbag. I carefully pressed the stop button on my digital voice recorder, safely saving the highly incriminating audio file. I paid for my sparkling water and walked out into the cool night air, feeling incredible. Carter thought he had backed me into a dark corner, but he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. I drove back to my hotel suite. As soon as I was inside, I connected the small recording device to my encrypted laptop and immediately uploaded the audio file to 3 separate secure remote cloud servers. I played the recording back, listening to Carter arrogantly lay out his entire illegal plan. Hearing him confess to corporate fraud with such pride was deeply satisfying, but it also triggered a very specific instinct in my brain. In the world of forensic accounting, there is a core psychological rule. If a financial officer is arrogant and sloppy enough to commit blatant fraud in the present, it almost guarantees they have committed worse crimes in the past. Carter thought he was an absolute genius for setting up that shell company, but it was a rushed, desperate move. I realized I needed to look backward. I needed to examine the very foundation of Marcus's logistics startup. If Carter was willing to illegally transfer massive corporate assets today, what was he willing to do 3 years ago when the company was desperately begging for its initial funding? I opened my secure terminal, bypassed the standard corporate access portals, and dove straight into the deeply encrypted archives of the startup's historical tax filings and original investment prospectuses. I pulled up the massive digital file for their Series A funding round. This was the exact moment 3 years ago when Marcus secured his first $5 million from external venture capitalists. Serious institutional investors require a rigorous independent financial audit before wiring that kind of capital to a new tech founder. I scrolled through hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon and highly complex financial spreadsheets. Finally, I reached the last page, the audit certification. This was the critical page legally verifying that the entire financial review had been conducted accurately by an independent licensed professional. My eyes locked onto the bottom right corner of the glowing screen, and my heart genuinely skipped a beat. There, perfectly rendered in black ink, was my signature. It was listed right above my official New York State CPA license number. I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. I had never audited Marcus's startup for their Series A round. It would have been a massive legal conflict of interest for a spouse to officially audit her own husband's company for external investment. Carter knew that. Marcus knew that, but they were so desperate for that initial $5 million cash injection that Carter had simply lifted an old signature from one of my personal tax documents, digitally isolated it, and blatantly forged it onto the official venture. Capital Contracts. He used my pristine professional reputation and my elite corporate accounting license to fraudulently secure millions of dollars from wealthy investors. This wasn't just a simple lie to hide money during a hostile divorce. This was massive federal wire fraud. It was severe identity theft. It was a direct, blatant violation of Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. By forging the signature of a licensed corporate forensic accountant, Carter had elevated his petty corporate shell games into a severe federal crime carrying a mandatory sentence in federal prison. I carefully downloaded the forged investment documents and placed them in the secure folder right next to the audio recording of Carter's dinner confession. I drafted a highly secure encrypted email to the senior partner of the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in Manhattan. I attached the massive files of evidence and simply wrote a brief professional message instructing them to rapidly prepare the final strike, but to hold all legal action until my explicit command. I hit send. A lesser person would have immediately called the federal authorities or confronted Marcus that night. But I didn't want a quiet out-of-court settlement or a simple, messy arrest. I wanted total destruction. If I attacked now, the Apex deal would fall through quietly, and Marcus would just play the victim, complaining about his vengeful wife to anyone who would listen. I needed them to walk into that massive downtown boardroom. I needed them to put on their expensive custom suits and smile confidently for the corporate cameras. I needed them to fly as high as humanly possible, believing they had absolutely won, so that when I finally clipped their wings, the fall would be absolutely fatal. 2 days after I secured the forged investment documents, my strategy of letting them fly high manifested in the most public way possible. I woke up on Thursday morning to my phone buzzing relentlessly. The notifications weren't frantic texts from Marcus or Carter. They were automated industry news alerts. I opened my browser and saw the front page of a prominent business publication like TechCrunch or Forbes. Right at the top was a massive exclusive feature article. The bold headline read, "Logistics Prodigy Secures $1.7 billion Apex Acquisition." Marcus had intentionally leaked a completely fabricated story to the press. He had authored a masterpiece of corporate fiction positioning himself as a brilliant self-made tech visionary who single-handedly revolutionized the logistics industry. The article spoke glowingly of his impending merger with Apex, framing it as the most anticipated tech acquisition of the year. He even cleverly mentioned the new shell company Carter had created, disguising it in the article as a highly strategic corporate restructuring designed to maximize shareholder value. There was zero mention of his frozen bank accounts, his catastrophic credit score, or his recent legal eviction from our marital home. Marcus was using a classic desperate tactic, aggressively leaking the acquisition to the major tech press to publicly force the hands of the Apex executives. He wanted to create so much public hype and industry momentum that Apex would rush to sign the final paperwork without looking too closely at his disastrous internal finances. To maintain this grand illusion of massive wealth, Marcus needed to put on a show. By Thursday night, my social media feeds were completely flooded with concrete proof of his severe financial recklessness. Chloe was actively live-streaming from a lavish victory party. Marcus had rented a massive triplex penthouse in one of the most expensive high-rise buildings in Tribeca. The video showed hundreds of guests, including local socialites, tech influencers, and minor celebrities mingling in the luxurious space. There were towering champagne pyramids, expensive catered caviar stations, and a live jazz band playing in the background. Marcus strutted through the crowd wearing a brand-new custom tuxedo, absolutely soaking up the loud applause and admiration of his guests. I knew exactly how much that penthouse cost for a single night, and I knew his corporate credit cards were still completely frozen. Curious, I opened my encrypted laptop and did a quick trace through secondary shadow financial networks. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the exact source of his funds. Marcus had taken out a massive short-term predatory loan from a highly unregulated private equity firm. Because traditional lenders like Mr. Sterling had completely rejected him, Marcus had used the fake PR article as collateral to borrow $3 million at an astronomically high 40% interest rate. He was literally funding his own fake victory party with financial poison. I turned my attention back to Chloe's livestream, just as Marcus stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony, overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. He tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon to quiet the cheering crowd. He flashed his signature arrogant smile and began his victory speech. He loudly thanked Carter for being the most brilliant financial mind in the entire industry. He thanked his mother Eleanor, standing right beside him in a new designer dress, for her tireless belief in his genius. And then he deliberately took a highly public shot at me. "There's one person who isn't here tonight," he announced into the microphone, his voice dripping with contempt. "My miserable soon-to-be ex-wife. When things got tough, she completely gave up. She lacked the grand vision to see what I was building. She's just a narrow-minded accountant who tried to drag me down and destroy my company out of pure jealousy. But true innovators cannot be caged by small-minded people. We drop the dead weight and we fly. The crowd cheered and applauded. Chloe panned her camera to show guests laughing and raising their glasses in absolute agreement. I scrolled through the live comments pouring into the video stream. Public opinion was completely on his side. They were calling him an absolute alpha and a massive inspiration. Strangers left hundreds of comments mocking the boring, bitter wife who foolishly tried to ruin a genius tech founder right before his biggest payday. I watched the entire spectacle while calmly sipping my evening tea. I felt no anger or humiliation. I felt overwhelming satisfaction. Let them cheer for him. Let him drink his expensive champagne and believe he had completely conquered the world. He had just publicly tied his entire ego and reputation to a $1,700,000,000 deal that I legally owned. The morning after Marcus's lavish champagne-fueled penthouse party, the inevitable financial hangover finally arrived. But it wasn't Marcus who felt the immediate pain. While the general public and naive social media influencers were busy cheering for the fake tech billionaire, the real money in the industry was waking up and carefully reading the fine print. At exactly 7:00 a.m. on Friday, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed the name Thomas Prescott. He was the lead angel investor who had injected the initial massive round of heavy capital into Marcus's startup 3 years ago. Thomas Prescott was a shrewd, incredibly wealthy man who made his fortune in commercial logistics long before Marcus even knew what the word meant. He didn't tolerate fools, and he absolutely despised being lied to. I answered on the second ring. Thomas didn't bother saying good morning. He aggressively demanded to know what exactly the strategic corporate restructuring mentioned in the Forbes article meant. He had seen the specific mention of a new entity, and his trained financial instincts had instantly triggered massive alarm bells. He had deliberately bypassed Marcus and Carter calling me directly because he knew I was the true financial architect keeping the startup breathing all these years. I took a slow sip of my morning coffee and told him the absolute brutal truth. I didn't sugarcoat a single detail. I calmly explained the entire Cayman Shell Company plot Carter had hastily engineered. I detailed how my soon-to-be ex-husband and his arrogant CFO were actively trying to strip the core proprietary routing software from the original company using completely forged board approval documents to illegally transfer the intellectual property into a new anonymous corporate vessel. Thomas Prescott went completely silent on the other end of the line. As a seasoned investor, he instantly understood the catastrophic implications. If Marcus successfully moved the software code out of the original startup, the shares held by Thomas and the other early investors would instantly become completely worthless. Marcus and Carter planned to sell the clean company directly to Apex pocket the entire $1,700,000,000 payout and leave the original angel investors holding an empty bag of a bankrupt, heavily indebted shell company. That arrogant kid is trying to completely cut us out of the exit, Thomas finally growled, his voice vibrating with rage. I gave him the runway to build this massive company, and he's trying to rob me. I confirmed his suspicions. Then I painted a vivid picture of Marcus's massive current desperation. I informed Thomas about the frozen commercial bank accounts, the severe default on their Midtown office lease, and the catastrophic business credit score. I even told him how Marcus had funded his lavish victory party the night before, using a highly toxic, predatory loan from an unregulated private equity firm. "What do we need to do?" Evelyn Thomas asked. His tone had shifted from pure rage to cold, calculated business. He knew I wouldn't have answered the phone if I didn't already have a highly strategic move prepared. I stepped fully into my role as a senior forensic accountant and laid out the exact battle plan. I advised Thomas to immediately contact his banking representatives and place a hard freeze on any pending operational capital injections his syndicate planned to release to the startup. I instructed him to formally invoke the emergency minority shareholder provision buried in their original investment contract. That specific legal maneuver would automatically flag any massive corporate asset transfer as highly disputed, preventing Marcus from finalizing the software shift cleanly without a massive legal fight. Within 20 minutes, Thomas conferenced in the 3 other major angel investors. I sat in my quiet hotel room and ran an absolute masterclass in corporate crisis management over the phone. I calmly explained the intricate layers of Carter's financial fraud to these immensely powerful men. I assured them I had secured the physical evidence of their massive crimes, including the audio confession and the forged documents. I made them a very simple promise. If they followed my exact instructions and formally aligned their voting blocks behind me, I would ensure the core intellectual property remained completely safe. I promised their initial investments would be fully protected during the impending Apex Corporation acquisition. The investors didn't hesitate for a second. They were absolutely furious at Marcus's blatant betrayal, but deeply impressed by my ruthless efficiency and absolute control over the situation. Right then and there, they formed an unbreakable legal and financial coalition behind me. Marcus truly believed he had won the battle of public opinion with his fake press leak, but he had just completely lost the only people who actually controlled his financial destiny. After finalizing the strategy with Thomas Prescott and the angel investors, I decided to permanently upgrade my living situation. Living out of a hotel suitcase was practical for a few days, but I needed a real fortress. By Friday evening, I signed a long-term lease on a stunning luxury condo in one of the most exclusive high-rise buildings in Tribeca. I was quietly unpacking my few remaining belongings on Saturday morning when the intercom buzzed. The building concierge informed me that my sister-in-law was waiting in the lobby. He said she was crying hysterically and aggressively, demanding to see me. I hesitated for a second before telling the concierge to send her up. I wanted to see exactly how quickly the rats were turning on each other inside Marcus's rapidly sinking ship. When I opened my heavy mahogany front door, Chloe practically collapsed into the grand entryway. She looked entirely different from the arrogant, materialistic woman who happily recorded my public humiliation less than 2 weeks ago. Her expensive designer makeup was smeared across her cheeks. Her usually perfect hair was a mess, and she desperately clutched a crumpled stack of printed papers in her shaking hands. She forcefully shoved the papers into my chest. "Evelyn, help me," she sobbed, her voice cracking with genuine terror. "You're the only one who knows how to trace this complex financial stuff. Carter is leaving me." I looked down at the crumpled papers in my hands. They were banking statements, but not from any standard domestic financial institution. They were detailed wire transfer receipts from a highly secretive offshore bank located in the Cayman Islands. I let her cry uncontrollably while I quickly and meticulously scanned the documents. Carter had been secretly funneling his personal executive salary and any shady consulting fees he could get his hands on into this offshore account for the last 8 months. But the heaviest piece of paper in the stack wasn't a bank statement. It was a printed email confirmation for a single first-class one-way flight to Georgetown, Cayman Islands. The flight was scheduled for the exact day after the official closing of the Apex Corporation acquisition. Attached to the same email thread was a digital consultation receipt from a highly aggressive divorce attorney known for representing wealthy men hiding their assets. "I found it on his unsecured iPad this morning," Chloe sobbed, pacing frantically across my polished hardwood floors. "He's going to take his massive executive bonus from the shell company, route it straight into that offshore account, and completely abandon me. He's going to leave me with absolutely nothing. Evelyn, help me freeze his assets right now." "I'll do whatever you want. I'll testify against him and Marcus in federal court. I'll give you all their computer passwords. Just don't let him leave me completely bankrupt." I calmly looked at the desperate woman crying in my beautiful new living room. For 5 long years, I had been the designated fixer for this deeply toxic family. Whenever Marcus overspent on his credit cards, I balanced the budget. Whenever Eleanor needed to quickly cover up a social faux pas, I fixed it. Whenever Chloe made a terrible financial mistake, like pawning a priceless family heirloom, I was expected to quietly fix it. They had completely drained my energy and rewarded my fierce loyalty with absolute cruelty. I carefully folded the offshore banking documents and handed them back to her, pressed. I didn't offer her a tissue or a glass of water. "I am not your forensic accountant, Chloe," I said, my voice cold and entirely devoid of emotion. "And I am certainly not your family." She stared at me in absolute shock, as if her brain couldn't comprehend that I was refusing to save her. "But you hold all the power now," she begged, grabbing my arm. "You can stop him. You're the only one who can fix this massive mess." I slowly and firmly removed her hand from my arm. "You stood in my kitchen just days ago and proudly told me that Carter was 10 times smarter than me," I coldly reminded her. "You happily bragged that he would destroy me financially and leave me with nothing. Turns out Carter really is destroying someone financially and leaving them with nothing. He just picked an easier target." I walked over to the front door and opened it wide. "If you want to stop your husband from leaving you, I highly suggest you hire your own lawyer," I said, pointing directly into the hallway. "But I am done fixing the mistakes of people who hate me. Clean up your own mess, Chloe." I practically pushed her out into the carpeted hallway. She stood there crying loudly, begging me to let her back in. I didn't say another word. I just looked her dead in the eye and slammed the heavy door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. By Monday morning, the absolute panic inside Marcus's collapsing tech startup had reached a fever pitch. Carter knew I had successfully blocked their shell company maneuver by rallying the angel investors against them over the weekend. He also knew his wife had visited my new luxury condo, meaning his secret offshore exit strategy was no longer a secret. Carter was completely cornered and desperately needed massive leverage to force my hand. So he decided to go on the offensive. He made the absolutely fatal mistake of trying to attack me using my own highly specialized profession. At exactly 9:00 a.m., a highly urgent email arrived. It was from a boutique accounting firm called Baxter & Stone Associates. The subject line was, "Notice of Pending Criminal Investigation." I opened the attached document and genuinely laughed out loud. Carter had hired a shady accounting firm to conduct a completely fabricated forensic audit of my past activities at the startup. The document heavily accused me of embezzling millions and maliciously triggering the commercial bank freeze to cover up my own massive financial crimes. The email demanded I join an immediate conference call to discuss a quiet out-of-court settlement. If I refused, they explicitly threatened to hand their fabricated audit directly to the FBI. Carter actually believed he could terrify a senior corporate forensic accountant with a fake audit. It was like bringing a cheap plastic knife to an artillery fight. I calmly logged into the virtual conference room at exactly 10:00 a.m. Carter immediately spoke, his voice dripping with unearned arrogance. "I hope you're ready to be reasonable," Evelyn Carter said smoothly. "We discovered your massive financial theft. I have 2 senior auditors from Baxter & Stone on the line right now. We can settle this quietly today, or you can end up in federal prison." One of the hired accountants cleared his throat. "This is Mr. Baxter," he announced, using a deep, artificially authoritative voice. "We spent the entire weekend conducting a rigorous review of the corporate ledgers. We have undeniable proof that you systematically stole company funds. If you do not immediately reverse the bank freeze and sign over the intellectual property to Marcus, we are ethically obligated to report you to federal authorities." I let a heavy silence hang on the line for a few seconds. I wanted them to feel absolutely confident before I utterly destroyed them. "Mr. Baxter," I began, my voice perfectly calm and razor-sharp. "I am looking at the official New York State Registry of Certified Public Accountants right now. Your primary state license number is 482629. Are you aware that your professional license was formally suspended for 6 months, exactly 3 years ago, due to gross negligence and unethical billing practices?" I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Mr." Baxter tried to defend himself, but I didn't let him speak. "Furthermore," I continued coldly, "I am deeply familiar with the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct. Threatening a colleague with criminal prosecution solely to obtain leverage in a civil marital dispute is a direct and severe ethical violation. You are actively trying to extort me using entirely fabricated financial documents provided by a desperate executive." Carter quickly interrupted, his voice suddenly higher and more panicked. "Don't listen to her, Baxter. She's just trying to scare you. Read her the forensic charges right now." I completely ignored Carter and focused entirely on the 2 terrified men who had foolishly taken his money. "Let me make this perfectly clear for both of you," I stated firmly. "I am a senior corporate forensic accountant. I have directly assisted federal agencies in prosecuting massive corporate fraud. I am actively recording this entire extortion attempt. If you do not formally retract this audit and drop Carter as a client in the next 60 seconds, I will forward this entire digital interaction directly to the state licensing board. I will personally ensure your firm is permanently stripped of its charter, and you both lose your professional credentials forever." The virtual conference line exploded into absolute chaos. Mr. Stone, the silent partner, suddenly started screaming at Carter. "We were not informed of this, Carter. You completely lied to us about who she is and her professional background. We are shutting down this investigation immediately." "No, wait," Carter screamed at them, demanding they stay on the line and finish the job he paid them for. But the 2 shady accountants knew they had stepped into a massive legal trap. They valued their licenses far more than any desperate cash Carter had promised them. "We are officially withdrawing as your representation," Mr. Baxter said, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "Do not ever contact our firm again." 2 loud digital beeps echoed through the conference room as the 2 accountants hastily disconnected from the call. Carter was left alone on the dead silent line with me. His entire offensive strategy had evaporated into thin air in under 4 minutes. He had absolutely no leverage, no money, and no escape route. "Are you quite finished playing your stupid games, Carter?" I asked softly. Because I was done asking. It was my turn. I disconnected the call, leaving him sitting in the absolutely terrifying wreckage of his own massive stupidity. By Tuesday afternoon, the total collapse of Carter's fake audit scheme clearly pushed Marcus into a state of absolute desperation. I finished my workday at my corporate firm and took the private elevator down to the executive underground parking garage. The massive concrete structure was dark and mostly empty at that hour. The only sound was the sharp, rhythmic echo of my heels hitting the cement. As I walked toward my car, I pressed the button on my key fob to unlock the doors. Just as the headlights flashed, a dark figure suddenly stepped out from behind a thick concrete pillar, completely blocking my path. I stopped, but I didn't panic. It was Marcus. He looked horrific. The polished, arrogant tech founder persona was completely gone. His custom suit jacket was heavily wrinkled, and his silk tie hung loosely around his neck. He had dark, heavy bags under his bloodshot eyes, and he smelled of stale alcohol and pure panic. He aggressively closed the distance, stepping into my personal space, and slammed his hands down hard on the hood of my car, trapping me between his body and the vehicle. "You really think you've beaten me, don't you, Evelyn?" he sneered. His voice echoed loudly through the empty parking garage. "You think you can just freeze my bank accounts, steal my house, and completely destroy my massive corporate acquisition without any severe consequences?" I calmly looked down at his hands resting on my car, then looked up into his panicked eyes. I politely asked him to step away from my vehicle before I called building security to forcefully remove him for trespassing. He laughed loudly like a madman. He aggressively reached inside his suit jacket and violently pulled out a thick stack of folded legal papers. He shoved the document directly into my face, waving it around like a massive flag of victory. "Do you remember signing this exactly 7 years ago?" he demanded, his voice rising to a panicked shout. "This is our official prenuptial agreement. I spent the entire night reading every single page of this contract with my new lawyers." "I found the interference clause, Evelyn." I stood up straight, letting him continue his desperate rant. Marcus aggressively flipped through the heavy document and pointed to a dense paragraph of legal text. He loudly proclaimed that according to a highly obscure protective clause buried in the contract, any spouse who intentionally engaged in financial sabotage or hostile interference against the other's primary business automatically forfeited their entire right to all shared marital assets. Marcus arrogantly declared that by freezing his corporate credit cards and contacting his commercial banking partners, I had blatantly violated the prenuptial agreement. "You get nothing," he screamed. His face flushed. "The law is completely on my side now. By trying to ruin my startup, you legally forfeited your right to half the company and surrendered your claim to our marital assets. You outsmarted yourself, Evelyn." He pulled a separate piece of paper and a silver pen from his pocket. He slammed the paper onto the hood of my car right on top of the prenuptial agreement. "That is a legally binding quitclaim deed for the $15 million estate," Marcus said, breathing heavily. "You are going to sign that deed right now and legally transfer the property title back to my name. You are going to officially reverse the commercial bank freeze, and you are going to walk away from the Apex Corporation acquisition with absolutely nothing." I looked at the silver pen, rolling slightly on the hood of my car. I didn't reach for it. I asked him what would happen if I refused his ridiculous demand. Marcus leaned in very close, his expression twisted into a look of absolute malice. "If you don't sign that paper right now, I am taking this prenuptial violation directly to the State Board of Accountancy," he threatened fiercely. "I will leak a massive story to the financial press detailing how a senior forensic accountant maliciously abused her professional credentials to illegally sabotage her husband's business out of pure jealousy. I will completely destroy your pristine corporate reputation. You will never work in the financial sector again. I will make sure you are entirely bankrupt and professionally ruined." He stood there, towering over me, breathing heavily, a look of total victory plastered across his face. He truly believed he had finally found the ultimate legal loophole to completely crush me. He thought the heavy threat of professional ruin would force me to immediately surrender to his demands. He was absolutely convinced he had played a brilliant winning hand. I looked at the furious, desperate man standing in the dark garage, and I felt absolutely no fear. I slowly reached into my own leather portfolio, preparing to entirely shatter his entire illusion. I reached my hand inside the smooth leather of my professional portfolio. Marcus was breathing heavily in front of me, entirely convinced that his threat of professional blackmail had completely paralyzed me. But instead of pulling out my cell phone or reaching for the silver pen, he demanded I use. I pulled out a thick stack of familiar legal papers. I looked at his aggressive red face and laughed out loud. The sound echoed off the cold concrete walls of the empty parking garage, totally shattering his aggressive momentum. Marcus blinked. His expression instantly shifted from triumphant arrogance to absolute confusion. "What's so funny?" he yelled, slamming his hand against the hood of my car again. "I'm not joking, Evelyn. I will ruin your career." I stepped slightly closer, refusing to be intimidated by his physical presence. I dropped my stack of papers directly on top of the quitclaim deed he had placed on my car. It was an exact copy of the prenuptial agreement he was currently holding in his sweaty hand. But my copy had a specific page marked with a bright red sticky note and several lines of dense legal text highlighted in glowing yellow ink. "The problem with you, Marcus, is that you have the attention span of an arrogant child," I said, my voice perfectly steady and full of calm authority. "You spent an entire night desperately reading this contract with your expensive new lawyer, but it seems you stopped reading the second you found a clause you thought you could use against me. You should have kept reading." To page 12. I reached out and flipped my document open directly to the highlighted page. I tapped my perfectly manicured nail on the bright yellow text. "Read section 4, paragraph B," I commanded. Marcus stared at the paper. His eyes darted quickly across the highlighted legal jargon. I watched the remaining color rapidly drain from his face. It was the strict infidelity clause, but it wasn't a standard moral clause. Because I was a forensic accountant when we got married, I had personally insisted on a very specific financial stipulation. The clause explicitly stated that, if either party committed an act of infidelity and utilized any shared marital funds or corporate assets guaranteed by marital funds to facilitate that affair, they automatically and permanently forfeited their entire equity claim to all shared marital assets. "You took your 4-year-old marketing assistant Lexi to the executive retreat in Aspen exactly 3 months ago," I said, laying out the cold, hard facts. "You used the corporate expense account, which is fully supported by my personal financial guarantee, to buy her a first-class plane ticket and an adjoining luxury hotel suite. You actively used marital funds to finance your little affair, Marcus." He opened his mouth to deny it, but I cut him off immediately. "Don't even try to lie," I warned him coldly. "I have the flight manifests, the hotel billing statements, and the internal corporate ledgers that clearly show how you and Carter tried to hide those expenses as vendor relations. By actively mixing our marital funds with your infidelity, you triggered Section 4, Paragraph B. You have absolutely no power to void my rights under the hostile interference clause because your explicit violation preceded my bank freeze by 3 months." Marcus stood there, completely stunned. The heavy realization was visibly crushing him. 7 years ago, when we signed this document, he was entirely focused on protecting his own hypothetical tech millions from me. So he didn't even bother reading the extremely strict financial trap drafted by his own lawyers at my request. He blindly signed a legally binding document that gave me absolute power to strip him of everything if he ever cheated, using our money. "So go ahead and call the State Board of Accountancy, Marcus," I challenged him, stepping even closer. "Tell them how a forensic accountant strictly enforced a legally binding financial contract that you deliberately violated by embezzling funds to sleep with your young subordinate. Let's see how much sympathy you get from the financial press. And you can take this ridiculous quitclaim deed and throw it in the trash, because under this prenuptial agreement, you just surrendered any remaining fractional equity you thought you had in that $15 million house." His arrogant persona was completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The utter humiliation of being entirely outmaneuvered, using his own legal contract, was too much for his massive, fragile ego to bear. Marcus let out a loud scream of pure rage. He violently snatched his crumpled papers off the hood of my car and aggressively kicked the heavy concrete pillar next to us. He spun around and stormed off into the dark depths of the underground parking garage, screaming curses at the top of his lungs. His furious, panicked footsteps echoed into the shadows. I calmly picked up my copy of the prenuptial agreement, placed it back into my portfolio, and got into my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove out of the dark garage, leaving him entirely alone with his massive failure. Finally, the morning of the massive corporate acquisition arrived, bringing the absolute climax of this entire ordeal. The stage was perfectly set in downtown Manhattan on the 50th floor of the Apex Corporation headquarters. The boardroom was an imposing display of absolute corporate power designed to intimidate and impress. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a dizzying panoramic view of the city skyline. A massive, polished mahogany table stretched across the center of the expansive room, surrounded by 12 plush black leather executive chairs. Marcus and Carter walked into the boardroom like conquering kings. They had entirely shoved the catastrophic events of the week out of their minds. Marcus was wearing a brand new custom charcoal suit clearly purchased on whatever high-interest predatory credit he could scrounge up after my financial freeze. Carter walked beside him, carrying his expensive designer leather briefcase with his chest puffed out in arrogant pride. Sitting directly next to Marcus at the massive table was Lexi. You might be wondering why she was there after running away from me in absolute terror on the sidewalk just days ago. The answer is very simple: greed and pure delusion. After Marcus leaked the entirely fabricated article and threw his lavish penthouse party, he went back to Lexi. He smoothly convinced her that my forensic accounting spreadsheet was nothing more than a desperate fabricated lie from a bitter, jealous wife trying to ruin his massive success. Lexi chose to believe the expensive champagne and the glowing internet headlines over hard mathematical reality. Now she sat there glowing in a new luxury designer dress, eagerly waiting to officially become the romantic partner of a wealthy tech multimillionaire. Across the polished wooden table sat the senior executive team of Apex Corporation. There were 5 of them, all wearing impeccably tailored conservative business suits. In the center sat the chief executive officer, a strict, older man with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. He didn't smile widely or offer any lively small talk to his guests. He operated with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a powerful man who bought and destroyed smaller companies every single day. The tension in the room was incredibly thick and heavy. Carter confidently unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out the finalized legal documents for the new Cayman Shell Company. He slid them across the polished wood, his hands trembling slightly with nervous, eager anticipation. Carter immediately launched into a highly rehearsed summary of the sudden corporate restructuring. He aggressively explained that the newly formed entity now held all exclusive rights to the proprietary routing software. He used his best corporate jargon, trying to sound like a brilliant financial architect, completing a historic masterpiece, completely covering up the massive federal fraud he committed to get there. The Apex executives listened to Carter in silence. They didn't ask any questions about the sudden legal restructuring or the missing original angel investors. They just nodded in quiet agreement. A junior legal associate for Apex Corporation stepped forward and placed a thick stack of heavy premium paper directly in the center of the mahogany table. This was the final acquisition contract. This document was the absolute culmination of all Marcus's relentless lies and Carter's massive financial fraud. The bold black text on the very first page clearly stated the total corporate purchase price exactly $1.7 billion. Marcus stared at the legal document like it was a holy artifact. His breathing became shallow and fast. This was the exact moment he had sacrificed his marriage, his mother's retirement fund, and the future of his own employees for. He truly believed he had successfully bypassed his catastrophic credit score, his frozen commercial bank accounts, and the furious venture capitalists. He had completely convinced himself that the strict prenuptial agreement I showed him in the dark parking garage was just an empty threat he could easily fight in civil court once this massive deal officially cleared. Lexi leaned in very close to him, resting her hand on his arm. She whispered an excited congratulation into his ear, which made him flash his signature arrogant smile. Marcus reached up and casually adjusted his expensive silk tie. He looked confidently across the table at the Apex CEO and smugly stated that this acquisition would completely revolutionize the global logistics industry. He boldly promised the executives they were making the smartest financial investment of the entire decade. The Apex CEO simply interlaced his fingers and politely gestured toward the heavy document. He calmly invited Marcus to sign the final signature page to officially conclude the massive transaction. Marcus pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from the inside pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He uncapped it with a smooth, practiced motion. He pulled the thick contract closer to his chest and flipped directly to the last page, where a small, yellow, sticky flag indicated his required signature line. He positioned the gold nib of the pen just millimeters above the thick premium paper. He was one signature away from walking out of that sleek, glass-walled boardroom with $1.7 billion and a permanently fabricated reality. The room was completely silent, save for the faint hum of the building's massive air conditioning system. He pressed the gold pen to the paper. Just as the dark black ink began to bleed into the thick premium paper, the massive double mahogany doors at the far end of the boardroom were violently thrown open. The heavy wood slammed loudly against the glass walls, sending a sudden physical shockwave of sound echoing through the dead silent room. Marcus flinched so hard his hand jerked violently, dragging the expensive gold pen across the signature line in a jagged, meaningless black streak. He dropped the pen onto the polished table and whipped around, eyes wide with anger and sudden terror. I walked into the sleek, glass-walled boardroom with my head held high. I was wearing an impeccable navy blue power suit and a pair of pristine designer heels. I didn't look like the tired, broken wife they had publicly humiliated in a restaurant weeks ago. I didn't look like the woman Marcus had aggressively threatened in a dark underground parking garage. I looked exactly like the senior corporate forensic accountant who held the absolute keys to their entire financial universe. Flanking me on either side were two massive men in immaculate dark gray suits. They were the senior managing partners from the most ruthless and feared corporate litigation firm in the entire city. They carried heavy black leather briefcases and wore expressions of absolute cold professionalism. Marcus immediately lost his mind. His carefully constructed persona of a calm, brilliant tech visionary vanished in an instant. He jumped up from his plush leather executive chair, his face rapidly turning a dark, violent shade of red. "Security," he screamed at the top of his lungs, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "Call building security right now and have this crazy woman dragged out of here. She has absolutely no right to be in this building. She is a completely unauthorized individual actively trying to sabotage a highly confidential corporate negotiation." Carter violently shoved his heavy chair back and stood up. His perfectly tailored designer suit suddenly looked too tight for his shaking frame. He aggressively slammed both hands onto the mahogany table, demanding we leave immediately. His arrogant, smooth corporate voice was entirely gone, replaced by a panicked, high-pitched stammer. He recognized the two incredibly expensive litigators standing next to me, and he knew exactly what their presence meant. Beside them, Lexi physically shrank down into her heavy leather chair. All the glittering, excited joy from moments ago completely vanished from her pale face. She recognized me immediately, and she instantly recognized the thick leather portfolio I was carrying. She pressed herself back against the glass wall, looking like a terrified child who finally understood a massive hurricane was about to tear the entire building apart. The senior executives of Apex Corporation didn't panic. They didn't shout for security or look confused by the sudden explosive intrusion. They simply sat back in their expensive chairs and watched the chaotic spectacle with cold, calculated interest. The CEO, the strict older man with silver hair, slowly looked away from a hysterical Marcus and turned his sharp, calculating eyes directly toward me. He carefully took in the two prominent corporate litigators standing by my side, noting their aggressive posture and the heavy legal briefcases they were now calmly placing on the edge of the mahogany table. Marcus kept screaming, demanding that the Apex corporate legal team formally arrest me for severe corporate espionage and hostile interference. He was practically hyperventilating, gasping for air as he desperately tried to protect his massive fake payday. The CEO calmly reached forward and placed his hands flat on the mahogany table. He raised a single hand directly in Marcus's direction. The simple, silent gesture commanded so much authority that Marcus's panicked screaming died instantly in his throat. The massive room fell back into a heavy, deafening silence. The silver-haired executive looked at Marcus with an expression of deep professional disgust. Then he slowly turned his attention back to me, leaning back slightly in his leather chair. "Let her speak," the executive commanded. His deep voice echoed smoothly and firmly across the long wooden table. The absolute trap finally snapped shut. The lead attorney, standing to my right, stepped forward without saying a single word. He pulled a massive black binder overflowing with legal documents from his dark leather briefcase. He dropped the heavy binder directly into the center of the polished mahogany table right next to the fraudulent acquisition contract Marcus was about to sign. The loud thud echoed through the silent room like a judge's gavel coming down to deliver a final guilty verdict. I slowly walked up to the table, keeping my eyes locked onto Marcus. The arrogant smile was entirely gone from his face, leaving a pale mask of pure terror. "You can't sell the intellectual property, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly calm and clearly audible in the expansive glass-walled room. "Because you do not actually own it." Marcus laughed nervously and looked desperately toward the Apex Corporation executives. "She's crazy," he stammered, waving a hand dismissively at me. "She's just a bitter, disgruntled wife going through a messy divorce. She's trying to sabotage my massive success out of pure jealousy. We own the software. Carter just finished transferring the exclusive rights to the new entity." Yesterday afternoon, Carter immediately jumped in, desperately propping up Marcus's massive lie. "That is entirely correct," Carter insisted, his voice an octave higher than normal. "The board of directors formally approved the transfer of the intellectual property. The shell company holds the sole copyright to the routing software. Her allegations are completely baseless, and we have the legal paperwork to prove it. I didn't even look at Carter. I just reached out and flipped the heavy black binder open to the very first tab. I slid a certified federal document across the table directly to the Apex CEO. 3 years ago, your initial logistics startup was on the brink of total financial collapse. Marcus I methodically explained, laying out the cold, hard facts of his failure in front of the most powerful men in the industry. You had completely burned through your initial seed funding. Your creditors were actively preparing to force you into a highly public and humiliating bankruptcy. You sat on our kitchen floor crying like a child, begging me to use my personal wealth to save your fragile ego from total public destruction. I paused for a second, letting the humiliating image of the self-proclaimed tech visionary crying on the kitchen floor sink into the minds of everyone in the room. I paid off your massive debts, Marcus, I continued, the tone of my voice dropping to a razor-sharp edge. I cleaned up your corporate ledgers and secured your immediate financial future. But I am a forensic accountant and a private wealth manager. I never write a blank check without securing the underlying collateral. When I paid off your creditors, I legally restructured the entire foundation of your tech company. I required you to formally sign over the exclusive federal copyright of the core proprietary routing software code directly into my private trust. Marcus stared at me, his jaw hanging slightly open, unable to form a coherent word. He was desperately searching his memory for the complex legal paperwork he had blindly signed 3 years ago in his desperate rush to avoid bankruptcy. You never owned the software code, Marcus. I told him, delivering the absolute brutal truth. My private trust owns the intellectual property. Your logistics startup was only ever granted a revocable commercial license to utilize the software for daily operations. You were essentially just renting the code from me. You are nothing but a tenant in your own fake empire. Carter let out a loud, sharp gasp. But the transfer, he whispered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the heavy binder. We filed the transfer papers. You cannot legally transfer an asset that your company does not own, Carter, I replied, completely shattering his entire financial illusion. Your highly secretive Cayman Shell company is nothing but a completely worthless empty vessel. You spent the entire weekend committing massive federal wire fraud just to transfer a fake digital shadow. I turned my attention back to the Apex CEO, who was quietly reading the certified copyright registration I had handed him. Furthermore, I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the boardroom could hear me, that specific commercial license, granting Marcus's startup permission to use my software, contains a very strict termination clause. If the licensee engages in unauthorized corporate restructuring, malicious asset transfers, or fraudulent financial reporting, the license is immediately and permanently revoked. I pulled one final sealed document from the binder. I placed it directly on top of the fraudulent $1.7 billion acquisition contract. I officially filed the legal revocation notice in federal court at exactly 8:00 a.m., I announced. Marcus no longer has any legal right to use, sell, or license that software. The tech company you are about to buy is entirely dead. There is absolutely nothing left to sell. Marcus looked desperately toward Carter. He needed Carter to pull some brilliant legal maneuver to save their massive payday. But Carter was completely paralyzed in his chair. Heavy beads of sweat were rapidly cascading down Carter's forehead, soaking deep into the stiff collar of his expensive designer shirt. Carter knew enough about finance to realize the federal revocation document I just placed on the table was bulletproof. He knew his hastily constructed shell company was officially dead, and his severe federal crimes were entirely exposed. Marcus realized his brother-in-law couldn't save him, so he turned back to the Apex executives in a state of absolute panic. He aggressively leaned over the polished mahogany table, physically trying to block the CEO's view of the heavy black binder. Please do not listen to her, he pleaded, his voice thick with desperation. She is just a bitter wife trying to ruin my life over a messy divorce. I can easily fix this minor issue right now. Give me 24 hours and my new corporate lawyers will clear up this entire misunderstanding. I will even cut $200 million off the acquisition price right now just to close the deal. Please just pick up the pen and sign the contract. The silver-haired CEO didn't pick up the gold pen. He didn't even look at the fraudulent contract Marcus was desperately pushing toward him. The executive simply reached out and calmly closed the thick leather folder containing Marcus's fake documents. He methodically buttoned his tailored suit jacket, stood up from his plush leather executive chair, and slowly walked around the massive wooden table. Marcus let out a sharp gasp, truly believing the powerful older man was coming over to physically throw me out of the boardroom. But the executive didn't even look at Marcus. He walked right past him like he didn't exist. The powerful man stopped directly in front of me. His cold, calculated expression instantly melted into a warm, highly respectful smile. He extended his right hand toward me. I reached out and shook it firmly. "Everything is in perfect order," Evelyn, the CEO, said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute professional admiration. "The legal department meticulously reviewed the final intellectual property transfer documents your team sent over last night." Marcus froze. His hip bumped hard against the solid edge of the mahogany table. "What are you talking about?" he gasped, looking desperately between me and the powerful executive. "You can't do business with her. I am the original founder of the startup. I created the routing software. She's just an accountant." The CEO turned slightly toward Marcus with an expression of pure disgust. "You vastly underestimate the rigorous due diligence process of a massive corporate conglomerate, Marcus," the executive stated coldly. "When we prepare to spend $1.7 billion, we examine every single line of code and every legal document attached to the asset. We discovered the glaring legal discrepancies regarding your intellectual property ownership exactly 3 weeks ago. We immediately traced the actual federal copyright directly back to Evelyn's private trust. When we contacted her to clarify the massive legal anomaly, she was highly cooperative and incredibly professional." I stepped forward, standing confidently beside the powerful man who was supposed to make Marcus a billionaire. "Apex Corporation had absolutely no interest in buying your failing logistics startup, Marcus," I explained, as his eyes widened in horror. "They never wanted your leased office space, your massive short-term debts, or your terrible executive management structure. The only thing they ever wanted was the core proprietary routing software code. And, since I am the sole legal owner of that specific digital asset, they have been quietly negotiating the sale directly with me for the last 3 weeks." The senior Apex attorney standing near the window calmly opened his own heavy briefcase and pulled out a single piece of premium paper. He neatly slid it across the glass table directly to Marcus. "That is not a pending contract. That is a certified financial bank wire confirmation. The $1.7 billion acquisition officially closed, Marcus," he said, delivering the ultimate financial death blow. The entire sum was wired directly into Evelyn's private trust account at exactly 9:00 a.m. "Your highly secretive shell company will not receive a single cent. You are completely bankrupt." A loud, pathetic sob echoed from the far corner of the room. Lexi had finally grasped the absolutely brutal reality of the situation. The man she had trusted her entire future to wasn't a brilliant tech visionary. He was a bankrupt, heavily indebted fraud who had just lost $1.7 billion right in front of her eyes. She slowly stood up. Her bright designer dress suddenly looked incredibly out of place. She quietly backed toward the heavy boardroom doors, eager to get as far away from the massive wreckage as possible. Carter simply buried his sweaty face in his trembling hands, knowing his entire life was completely over. Marcus was left standing alone, crushed by the absolute weight of his massive, undeniable failure. The heavy silence that followed the CEO's announcement was absolute and deafening. Marcus stood there like a statue, his hand still hovering over the mahogany table where the fraudulent contract lay. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a massive cliff and was desperately waiting to hit the ground. Carter was hyperventilating, gasping for air as he desperately tried to loosen his expensive silk tie. They both knew their massive financial house of cards had completely collapsed, but they still had absolutely no idea how deep the final drop really was. I didn't even give them a moment to process their catastrophic loss. The grand finale of my meticulous planning was already perfectly in motion. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom that my lawyers had closed earlier suddenly burst open for a second time. This time, it wasn't a team of high-paid lawyers making a grand entrance. It was a group of 6 stern-looking men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs. The FBI had officially arrived, accompanied by 2 senior investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Marcus gasped loudly and stumbled backward in terror. He knocked over his heavy leather executive chair. The chair slammed loudly against the glass wall, but no one moved to pick it up. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an absolutely unreadable expression, walked directly into the center of the expansive room. He didn't ask for permission to speak, and he didn't care about the powerful Apex executives sitting at the table. He simply pulled a thick stack of official arrest warrants from the inside pocket of his jacket. "Marcus and Carter, you are both under federal investigation." The The lead agent announced his voice, echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. Carter immediately threw his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Wait, there's been a massive misunderstanding," Carter pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I'm just the chief financial officer. I was only following the direct orders of the founder. Marcus made all the final executive decisions." The federal agent didn't even blink at Carter's pathetic attempt to throw his own brother-in-law under the bus. "There is no misunderstanding," the agent replied coldly. "We received a highly detailed encrypted data packet from a licensed corporate forensic accountant exactly 48 hours ago. The evidence is completely comprehensive and absolutely undeniable." I stepped forward, standing directly next to the federal agent. I looked Marcus dead in the eye, ensuring he knew exactly who had orchestrated his absolute destruction. "I gave them everything, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I gave the federal agents the crystal-clear audio recording of Carter sitting in a dimly lit steakhouse, arrogantly confessing to illegal corporate restructuring and massive asset hiding. I gave them undeniable proof that your chief financial officer blatantly forged my signature and my CPA license number onto your original Series A venture capital funding documents. And most importantly, I gave them the exact digital routing numbers, proving that you both actively embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the retirement accounts of your own employees to fund your lavish lifestyles and buy expensive jewelry for your mistress." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The sheer volume of federal crimes I had just listed completely paralyzed him. He finally realized that while he was busy leaking fake stories to the tech press and drinking expensive champagne in a rented penthouse, I was meticulously building an inescapable federal prison around him. The agents moved quickly. 2 FBI agents approached Carter, grabbed his arms, and forced them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the pristine boardroom. Carter, the arrogant man who proudly bragged about his elite financial mind and his secret offshore accounts, began to openly weep as he was formally read his Miranda rights. He was officially arrested for severe federal wire fraud and massive corporate forgery. Another pair of agents approached Marcus. He didn't fight them. He didn't scream or threaten to ruin my career. He just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around his wrists. He was formally placed under arrest for grand corporate embezzlement and severe financial fraud. Amidst the chaotic arrests, I glanced toward the far corner of the expansive glass room. Lexi, the young marketing assistant who had arrogantly told me to walk away so she could marry a tech billionaire, quietly grabbed her designer purse while the federal agents were busy reading Marcus his rights. She slowly backed out toward the secondary exit doors. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't offer a single word of comfort to the man who had ruined his entire life to impress her. She simply slipped out the back door and vanished into the corporate hallway. Marcus was completely abandoned the exact second his money disappeared. I stood quietly beside my lawyers and watched the federal agents forcefully march my handcuffed soon-to-be ex-husband and his weeping CFO out of the boardroom. The massive $1,700,000,000 acquisition was officially mine, and the 2 arrogant men who had maliciously tried to destroy me were entirely gone. The room was finally clean. Exactly 6 months have passed since that chaotic morning in the glass-walled boardroom of Apex Corporation. I am currently standing on the expansive private terrace of my new $30 million penthouse suite in Tribeca. A warm evening breeze blows gently as I look out over the glittering downtown skyline, holding a crystal glass of rare vintage red wine, taking a slow sip. There are no panicked calls from angry commercial creditors. There are no mocking comments from an arrogant husband constantly belittling my career. There is only absolute silence and the deep, overwhelming satisfaction of a life completely rebuilt on my own terms. The massive $1,700,000,000 acquisition payout sits securely in my private trust, and my independent forensic accounting firm has grown exponentially since the news of the massive corporate fraud became entirely public. The justice system moved with shocking speed when presented with an absolute mountain of undeniable financial evidence. Marcus didn't become the brilliant tech billionaire he always arrogantly believed he was destined to be. Instead, he is currently wearing a standard-issue uniform, serving a mandatory 50-year sentence in a high-security federal correctional facility. His highly public criminal trial completely shattered any remaining illusion of his corporate genius. The tech press that once hailed him as a massive visionary quickly turned on him, publishing long, humiliating articles detailing his massive embezzlement and his pathetic attempt to steal the retirement funds of his own employees. Lexi never visited him once. She completely faded into absolute obscurity the exact moment his bank accounts were permanently frozen. From drinking expensive champagne in rented luxury penthouses, Marcus is now eating terrible cold food in a cafeteria surrounded by thick concrete walls. Carter suffered an equally devastating and highly public fate. The man who constantly bragged about his elite financial mind and his secret offshore accounts was completely stripped of his professional dignity. He was permanently disbarred by the state licensing board, his credentials entirely revoked before his federal trial even officially began. He is currently under strict house arrest, anxiously awaiting his own severe federal sentencing for massive wire fraud and corporate forgery. Because he forged the signature of a licensed forensic accountant, he is facing several long years behind bars. Chloe immediately filed for a highly contentious divorce the exact moment federal authorities entirely seized the offshore Cayman Island accounts. She quickly realized her wealthy, privileged lifestyle was completely over without Marcus's stolen money or Carter's inflated executive salary to constantly support her expensive shopping habits. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a rough part of the city. She now works as a low-level front desk receptionist, constantly complaining to anyone who will listen about how unfair her life is. But perhaps the most poetic justice of all was reserved entirely for Eleanor. The arrogant, deeply entitled woman who eagerly threw my expensive winter coats onto the front lawn and loudly called me a pathetic gold digger is now painfully learning the true value of $1. Because Marcus had legally drained her entire life savings using the power of attorney she blindly signed, Eleanor was left with massive, crushing financial debts. She could no longer afford her lavish Greenwich Country Club memberships or her weekly expensive spa days. To avoid drowning completely in a humiliating public bankruptcy, Eleanor was forced to swallow her massive pride and get a minimum wage job. She currently works as a frontline cashier at a local Whole Foods, right in the middle of our old, wealthy neighborhood in Connecticut. She spends her long days standing on her aching feet, scanning barcodes and bagging groceries for the exact same wealthy women she used to maliciously gossip about while drinking expensive martinis. I take another sip of my rich vintage wine and listen to the faint, pleasant hum of city traffic below. My cell phone vibrates softly on the sleek glass outdoor patio table. I pick it up and casually glance at the glowing screen. It is an automated email notification from the Federal Prison Communication System. Marcus used his highly limited weekly computer time to send me yet another desperate message. I opened the email and briefly read the pathetic contents. He is begging me to deposit some cash into his prison commissary account so he can buy better soap and some decent snacks. He complains bitterly about the terrible living conditions and begs for my forgiveness, claiming he finally realizes what a massive mistake he made in underestimating me. I feel absolutely no pity or lingering guilt. I don't feel the need to reply or gloat over my massive, undeniable victory. I simply press the delete button and watch his pathetic plea completely vanish into the digital trash bin forever. I lock my phone screen and turn my attention back to the beautiful, glittering city skyline that I now entirely own. There are men who think they own the sky simply because a woman is quietly holding the ground steady for them. Have you ever had to let a toxic person crash back down to reality? Let me know your story in the comments below. Evelyn's story teaches us an incredibly valuable lesson about the true nature of power and the absolute necessity of emotional control in the face of profound betrayal. In toxic relationships, we often mistakenly believe that whoever screams the loudest or causes the biggest scene holds the most authority. Narcissistic individuals thrive on creating chaotic public spectacles, hoping to extract a desperate emotional reaction from their victims to validate their own fragile egos. However, Evelyn beautifully demonstrated that true strength is found in absolute silence and meticulous preparation. When she was cruelly humiliated by her husband in that high-end restaurant, she didn't give him the satisfaction of her tears or a dramatic screaming match. She understood that uncontrolled emotion makes us sloppy, while logic and data make us lethal. Furthermore, this story shines a bright light on the hidden heavy burden of being the designated family fixer. For 5 long years, Evelyn quietly propped up her ungrateful husband and his highly toxic relatives, constantly shielding them from the harsh consequences of their own reckless financial behavior. The most empowering takeaway is that you don't always have to actively fight a toxic person to defeat them. Sometimes the most devastating and effective action you can take is simply walking away and completely removing the invisible safety net you've generously been providing. When you finally stop fixing their messes, they will inevitably collapse under the heavy weight of their own arrogance and incompetence. We must learn to fiercely guard our personal energy and establish ironclad boundaries. You are never obligated to offer your tireless loyalty, your hard-earned financial stability, or your mental health to people who actively disrespect you. If you ever need to reclaim your peace and walk away from a toxic environment, let them fall.